Mr. President, I think most people understand that the United States today is in the midst of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. What I want to do is just take a very few minutes to talk about how we got to where we are today and what policies we need, in my view, to move this country forward in a very bold way so that we begin to create the millions of jobs that the middle class of this country desperately need. Let me begin by taking a quick look back to where we were in January of 2009, and it's important that we take that look back because if we don't know how we got to where we are today, it's going to be very hard to move us in a different direction. January 2009 was, as we all recall, the very last month of the presidency of George W. Bush. In that month, we lost over 700,000 jobs, and that is just an extraordinary number, almost unprecedented. In fact, for the last months of the Bush administration, this country was hemorrhaging jobs as a result of the financial collapse brought about by the greed, the recklessness, and the illegal behavior on Wall Street. During that period, our gross domestic product, the total sum of all that our economy produces, had gone down by nearly 7% during the fourth quarter of 2008. 7% reduction. And that was the biggest decline in more than a quarter century. Some $5 trillion of Americans' household wealth evaporated in a 12-week period as people in Vermont and all over this country saw the value of their homes, their retirement savings, and their stocks plummet. So we were at a moment where some economists thought we might enter the worst depression in history, that the entire world's financial system would collapse. And in January of 2009, we were hemorrhaging 700,000 jobs. That's where we were. And while, of course, as a result of the collapse on Wall Street, the last months of the Bush administration were a total economic disaster, let us be clear about the cumulative 8 years of the Bush administration. What happened over that 8-year period? From 2001, when President Bush came into office, until January 2009, when he left, this country lost over 600,000 private sector jobs. Let me repeat that. During the Bush 8-year period, this country lost over 600,000 jobs. And the reason it's important to understand that is there are folks in this chamber and throughout this country who want to go back to those policies. Well, I'm not quite sure why anyone would want to go back to a set of economic policies which resulted in an 8-year period of a loss of 600,000 jobs. Net, there were a gain during the Bush administration of 1 million jobs, a very poor record, all of them government jobs, many of them in the military, in Homeland Security. Now, that is, under anybody's definition, an horrendous record of job creation. In fact, it is a record of job loss. Mr. President, during the Bush years, not only did we lose 600,000 private sector jobs, median family income dropped by $2,200. In other words, middle-class Americans earned significantly less income at the end of the Bush era than they did when he first came into office. During those 8 years, over 8 million Americans slipped out of the middle class and into poverty, over 3 million lost their pensions, and nearly 8 million lost their health insurance. During that period, 4.5 million manufacturing jobs disappeared. 4.5 million manufacturing jobs disappeared as companies shut down in the United States and moved to China, Mexico, Vietnam, and other low-wage countries. In the year 2000, we had over 17 million manufacturing jobs in this country. At the end of the Bush era in 2008, we had less than 12 million. And that is a huge reduction in good-paying manufacturing jobs, and in fact, the fewest number of manufacturing jobs since the beginning of World War II. Under President Bush, our trade deficit with China more than tripled, and our overall trade deficit nearly doubled. And I raise these issues once again because it is very important to understand that there are a number of people in this chamber who want to go back to those policies which were a demonstrative failure. But here's another important point, and very clearly. And median family income went down. While poverty increased, not everyone did badly during that period. In fact, during the Bush administration, the wealthiest 400 Americans saw their incomes more than double. All right? Middle class battered, median family income down, poverty increased, people lose their health insurance, people lost their pension, but the wealthiest 400 Americans saw their income more than double. In 2007, the wealthiest 400 Americans earned an average of $345 million in 1 year. On average, $345 million. In terms of wealth, as opposed to income, the wealthiest 400 Americans saw an increase in their wealth of some $400 billion during the Bush years. 400 people, an increase of $400 billion during the Bush years. Now, let me just talk for a moment about something which I consider to be very, very important, but we don't talk about it very much in the Senate. We don't talk about it very much in the media. It's not something we engage in polite conversation about. But it happens to be one of the important economic issues facing our country, and that is the issue of distribution of income and distribution of wealth. You know, all over America, whether it's in Minnesota or Vermont, everybody wants to know, in New England, everyone loves the New England Patriots or the Boston Celtics, and what people want to know is, at the end of the day, who won, who lost? What was going on in the game? Well, in terms of income distribution, that is the result of economic activity. Who won, who lost? And let's be very clear when we talk about winners and losers that the United States today has the most unequal distribution of income and wealth of any major country on earth. And that inequality is getting worse. Now, I know that many people choose not to talk about it, but I think it is imperative that we do talk about it. Today, the top 1% earns more income than the bottom 50%. Let me repeat that. Top 1% earns more income than the bottom 50%. In 2007, which is the last year that we had good statistics for, the wealthiest 1%, the top 1% of income earners, Mr. President, took in 23.5% of all of the income earned in the United States. Let me repeat that. Top 1% earned over 23% of all income earned in the United States. And here's an even more amazing statistic. The top 1/10 of 1%, top 1/10 of 1% took in 11% of total income, according to the latest data available. The problem that we're having in terms of income is that the situation is becoming more and more unequal. And we see that in the statistics, which are very clear. In the 1970s, the top 1% only made 8% of total income earned in this country, and now that number is 23.5%, almost 4 times as much. I would point out that the last time that income was this concentrated was in the year 1928. And I think we all know what happened in 1929. When you have such an unequal distribution of income and wealth, it is not only, to my mind, immoral and wrong that so few have so much and so many have so little, it is bad economics, because the economy grows when all people have money to spend, when consumers can spend money. When so much of our income and wealth is concentrated on the top, we run the significant likelihood of major economic recessions, and that's what's happening right now. Also, incredibly, in the midst of this growing inequality, and while the very wealthiest people in this country became much richer, and at the same time as our deficit soared, the tax rates for the people on top went down. Middle class declined, poverty increases, rich get richer, and the tax rates for the very wealthy go down. This was a result of not only tax breaks for the wealthy initiated during the Bush administration, but also, quite frankly, tax policy that took place before Bush. The result is that from 1992 to 2007, the latest statistics that we have, the effective federal tax rate, and that is what people really pay for the top 400 income earners in our country, was cut almost in half. Rich get richer, their effective tax rates are cut almost in half. Today we have a federal tax code that is so unfair, that is so absurd, that Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest people in the world, often points out that he pays a lower effective tax rate than does his secretary. Hedge fund managers who make $1 billion a year now pay a lower effective tax rate than many teachers, nurses, firefighters, and police officers. I should also add that in terms of wealth, as opposed to just income, inequality, of course, is also growing. Today, the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90%, and during the Bush years, the wealthiest 400 Americans saw their wealth increase by some $400 billion. Now, when a few people have incredible wealth and incredible income, they do not tuck that money under the mattress. They use that money. And the point that Senator Murray of Washington was making a few moments ago on the Disclosure Act is a very good example of how some of those folks are making money. Not content to have the top 1% earning more than 23% of all income in America, these folks want more. Their greed has no end. And what they are now doing as a result of the disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, a 5-4 decision, they and their corporate friends are now free to put as much money as they want into the political process, into television ads, into radio ads, and they do not have to disclose who they are. So you're going to have corporations with foreign interests getting involved in the American political process. You're going to have corporations putting all kinds of money into the political process, setting up phony institutions and front groups, and they don't have to tell the American people who they are. In addition to the Disclosure Act and the huge amount of money now flooding the political process, we have an enormous amount of lobbying and campaign contributions that are going right into the whole tax issue that we're debating right now. Mr. President, as you know very well, some of our Republican friends think, apparently, that the top 1% earning more income than the bottom 50% is not quite enough. That the fact we have given huge tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires for the last 15 years is not enough. They need more. So what some of our Republican friends are doing, and their friends on Wall Street and big money interests are doing, pouring huge amounts of money into the political process, which says that we should provide over a 10-year period $700 billion in tax breaks to the top 2%, that millionaires, those people making $1 million or more, should receive on average a $100,000 tax break, and they're fighting for tax breaks for the rich at the same time as they're saying, oh, isn't it terrible that we have a $13 trillion national debt? So they want to give $700 billion in tax breaks, top 2%, and then they say, oh, my goodness, isn't it awful that we have a record-breaking deficit and a large national debt, and they want to pass on those tax breaks to our kids and grandchildren. Increase the national debt so that we can give tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires. That makes zero sense to me. I think that is an incredibly dumb and irresponsible idea. What I think we should do, what I believe we should do, is that half of that $700 billion, instead of being given in tax breaks to the top 2%, should be used for deficit reduction. Let's do it now. And the other $350 billion should be invested in our infrastructure, rebuilding our roads, our bridges, our water systems, our schools, our transportation system, and putting people back to work. Our infrastructure is crumbling. Everybody knows that. We're going to have to address it now or later. Let's address it now in the middle of a recession. Let's put millions of people back to work, rebuilding America to make us more competitive in the global economy and make our economic system more efficient. I think, frankly, it makes a heck of a lot more sense to put millions of people to work rebuilding America's infrastructure and using $350 billion to lower the deficit than it is to give $700 billion in tax breaks to the top 2%. I hope that a majority of my colleagues, or in fact 60 of my colleagues, agree with that, because to me that is the policy this country desperately needs. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.